Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their schedule to join tonight. Looking forward to sharing some really interesting information with you and a workout style that some of you may be familiar with and some maybe not, but I think many of you, if you're not, you'll certainly have an appreciation for this workout style when we get to the end of the presentation tonight. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Dr. Arland Hill. I'm the owner of Genesis Wellness, where I work with patients and help them optimize their health. And I'm also the owner of Harvest Hills Ranch, along with my wife, Leah. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. But what we're going to be diving into tonight is this whole idea of HIIT, which is high intensity interval training. And just to help you have a better understanding of that, I'll spend a few moments early on tonight speaking about that and really what HIIT is and how it's different than some other exercise techniques out there. But one of the reasons that I was looking forward to sharing this with you tonight is that I personally got reacquainted with HIIT about 6 months ago, I'd say. And it was something that I realized, wow, there's a lot of attributes to this that I need to start harnessing. Now, I will be upfront and tell you, this is not the only exercise technique that I use, but it is one that I definitely lean on. I definitely take components of the HIIT theory and implement that and integrate it into a lot of my other workout techniques. And so I'll share some of those attributes with it or with you as we go through tonight. And hopefully you'll be able to do the same with your workouts. Now, I think I need to start off right out of the gate, just defining what is HIIT. Help you have a understanding for it so that as we go through the night, you can understand how to apply the information that I'm sharing with you. And in short, HIIT's an acronym. It stands for high intensity interval training. And there's also an acronym that you'll see sometimes, which is HIIT with just one I, which is just high intensity training. So that the difference there being the interval inclusion. And that can make a difference sometimes depending on what you're doing. But the idea behind this is that we're trying to achieve a maximum effort of output. And typically you're doing that through quick, intense bursts of exercise. It doesn't always have to be quick. It doesn't have to necessarily be a fast type of movement. There's other ways that we can increase the intensity, which I'll show you as well. But the intensity component is really critical to this. And because there is an interval aspect to what we're going to be talking about here, this is where you get into these short rest periods, which you can think about as a recovery period. So look at this as you have an all-out bout of exercise, and then you have a recovery period, and then you have another all-out bout of exercise, and then you have a recovery period. And this was something that the origins of this, in case you're curious about this, really came from the runner's world, for individuals that were out there training for long distances and trying to figure out how do they optimize their training period, but also not overtrain at the same time. And what they realized, a way that they could do this was that they could implement in these really high intense sprint activities and then bring the level back down to a jog, and then up it back up to a sprint, and then back down to a jog. And they would just keep cycling back and forth like this. And they began to realize, we see some pretty good results here, and we're not wearing our bodies out at the same time. And so wasn't long, of course, typically as goes with stuff like this, that information started getting out there into other sports environments. And this is where we see whether it's something like soccer or football or basketball or really many of these other sports that we tend to see, we tend to commonly see, HIIT started to infuse into those training environments as well. And then from there, it tends to go down into the lay public. And this is where we even see it with, if you look at some of the CrossFit, that's a name we hear a lot. If you look at some of the ideas behind CrossFit, a lot of the CrossFit concepts come back into HIIT. And don't take away from this that I'm advocating necessarily CrossFit or trying to steer you away from it. I'm not really trying to do either here. Just trying to give you ideas of where this, because of the impact that this training style can have, ultimately how many areas it's began to migrate into. And the nice thing about this is that when you incorporate in the resistance training part of this, you can use body weight, you can use barbells and dumbbells and bands and all kind of different techniques here that you can really make this you take the exercises you enjoy and you can make those HIIT oriented types of activity. So let me help you a little bit better understand what HIIT is and where it fits in the big scheme of different exercise patterns that are out there. If you look at these definitions, I've got 3 different ones that are on the screen here. And, as I look at this, I thought, maybe I should have put a bullet point above moderate intensity continuous exercise, which is just activity. And I'll differentiate that by saying that a lot of times individuals say, hey, look, I'm exercising, I'm out walking, I'm gardening. These aren't really exercise, they're activity. And I think it's important to differentiate that. So what we're going to be speaking to tonight is exercise. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with those things. It's more to say that if you're not reaching a certain threshold of intensity, then we're not creating any type of adaptation for the body, and there's not going to be any anticipated change associated with that. So you'll notice the first one here, and this is more of what we think about as the classic cardio type of activity, where we're looking at this moderate intensity performance that's taking place over a continual time frame. And then you go up from there, because that peaks out at about 75%. And the reason that peaks out at about 75% is that once you get over about that percentage, you can't do it for any continued sustained period of time. And so we're looking to move now into the high intensity training. And this is where you're getting into a threshold of output of about 85 to 90%. And so if you think about what would 100% look like, and you can see we actually quantify that too at 100% intensity, and you back that off just a bit, well, you'll appreciate that even at about 85 to 95% activity, you're not going to be able to sustain that for a period of time on and on and on. And I thought about this sprint interval training and just a way to help understand that. And you think about these Olympic sprinters, and you think about any gold medalist, any Olympic sprinter who's won the gold medal. And let's say we talk about the 100-meter sprint here. Well, why doesn't that individual also win the gold medal in the 400-meter and in the 800-meter and in the multiple-mile event? Well, the reason that they don't win is because they can't continue that level of intensity. So you wouldn't be able to do that training for an extended period of time. You wouldn't be able to do that running for an extended period of time. So we're looking to operate in this high intensity zone and maybe even bump up against this this sprint interval training from time to time and have 100% output as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about how the high intensity training works. And so if you think about this maximal and this sustaining this maximal intensity effort that I was alluding to, again, that's physiologically impossible to continue to do that on and on and on. And one of the primary reasons for that simply comes down to oxygen. So let me explain this concept that I'm sharing with you here, and is that this is where we need to differentiate some terms that you're familiar with, which are going to be aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism. Generically, and you'll see that as we go through, this is not necessarily true, but generically, we've talked about aerobic metabolism and aerobic exercise as things like the treadmill, the bike, swimming, elliptical machines, things of this nature. And then we talk about your anaerobic training as sprinting or weight training. Those are generally your common examples used for that. But these different methods, both methods are trying to create energy, but they're doing it in the presence or absence of oxygen. So when you think about aerobic metabolism, this is the way we create energy from breaking down our carbohydrates, our amino acids, our fats, but we do that in the presence of oxygen. And the aerobic metabolism is what's going to allow us to sustain production. So again, think about activities like cycling or running, walking, anything that you can do with a continual effort. I always like to ask folks too, when you go out and you take a walk, was it hard to take a walk? Was it laborious? Were you breathing hard at the end of that walk? And the answer is going to be no on that. So there's no reason to think that that walk as an exercise, if you will, is creating an adaptation response. Now, on the opposite side of that, so that was aerobic. On the opposite side of that, let's talk about anaerobic, which is still the idea of creating energy. You're still using carbohydrates, fats predominantly, some proteins in there as your energy source. but that's all taking place in the absence of oxygen. And so this is again where if you're absent of oxygen for any period of time, you're not going to be able to sustain that activity. So we're looking to try to mimic that. And this is where those short bursts of activity come in, where we're trying to mimic a sprint, if you will, ideology, but maybe not necessarily doing it with a sprint. Could do it with a sprint, but we don't have to do it with a sprint. Let's delve a little bit further here, because we need to understand these two aspects of metabolism to really get a handle on the HIIT ideology as a whole, and understand when we talk about these intense bouts of exercise, we're really looking to try to have a heart rate that is about 85% of our maximum, or over 85% of our maximum. And that's where we're starting to use this anaerobic metabolism to continually fuel our muscles. Now, a lot of people, when you talk about this, and you think of strenuous exercises, the idea of lactic acid, the muscle burn, starts to come into the conversation. And that's a byproduct of this anaerobic metabolism, if you will. But that's what builds up in the muscle. And over time, as that continues to build up, it's what's going to inhibit your performance from staying at a peak level for an extended period of time, and ultimately brings you into your muscle fatigue. Now, when you have a moderate intensity activity, the body is more capable of diffusing that lactic acid. So we don't see the same issues associated with that. So the body uses this aerobic metabolism throughout the day. We aren't doing things just in our activities of daily living that are causing us to get into our anaerobic metabolism. And so this is the zone that we need to find ways to get into. And I'm going to give you some ideas of how to do that as we continue on. Now, if you look at this, if you look for more information on this, you may come across a term called VO2 max. And VO2 max is simply the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use over a given period of time. And it's used to measure how fit you are. It's one of the metrics that is incorporated in trying to establish what is someone's level of athletic capacity. But there's a lot of things that can influence this. For example, just simply how many red blood cells someone has, or how trained they are towards an endurance activity, or how efficiently their heart can pump. I'll give you the example of, if you look at runners who train at high altitudes, those runners often come back to a lower altitude to compete, and the VO2 max, because they've increased the number of red blood cells, is likely going to be higher for those individuals. So that's one of the reasons they train like that. But as your exercise intensity rises, your oxygen uptake is also going to increase. So think about this: just the harder you work, the more oxygen you need to sustain that pace. And there's going to be a peak at which you can't continue to pull in more oxygen to keep up with that demand. And so if you think about, well, what's the more real world application? Like, what does this mean in terms of trying to implement HIIT? This is the concept of you need to be breathing hard. And I'll speak more about that as we go on. But if you're not breathing hard, you're not in a high intensity zone. Often think about this with something simply called the talk test. This is what I like to tell patients about, to use the talk test for yourself. And what that means is that if you could talk while you're doing an activity, your intensity on that activity is not high enough. If you're unable to talk, you're in the right zone of intensity. So just think, what am I scoring on my talk test, if you will? Can I have a conversation with someone in the same room with me, or do they have to wait until I finish that activity for me to converse with them? Now, when we tend to have excuses on why not to work out, we've all heard some of these. I tend to think that a lot of the excuses around working out are probably lack of mental preparation and not effectively thinking about activity in a particular way. That's probably an entire topic for another conversation. However, if you look at what another common excuse, if you will, is, it's going to be that I don't have time to work out. And this, to me, is one of my favorite things about HIIT. When I don't have a lot of time, or when I'm not going to be able to get my typical number of workouts in for a week, that is absolutely a time frame when I fall back on these HIIT principles, because it is a way to maximize the effort, maintain at a very minimum, but realistically progress you forward. And then also, you're going to need ample time to recover because, again, you're working at a high level. So the time factor really becomes a moot point when we start incorporating in these various HIIT principles. It's an extremely efficient workout pattern that really it'll fit into about any schedule. If you just look at comparisons on this where they've studied high intensity interval training, and I'm going to show you some of that information here momentarily. One of the examples on this was looking at taking three 15-minute HIIT sessions and comparing that against an hour of jogging on the treadmill and looking at which participants had more cardiovascular development, and the individuals engaging in the HIIT activity actually had more cardiovascular development as opposed to the individual who was doing the classic cardio activity. So, we don't want to get pigeonholed by that mindset of we've got to do a cardio activity to get our cardio in. That's absolutely not the case at all. What about burning more fat? This is another reason that we see folks want to exercise. I will tell you on this, just from, again, a mental standpoint, this should not be one of the sole reasons that you're working out. You should use other metrics. Am I getting stronger? Am I having more physical capabilities? What's my endurance and stamina throughout the day? Those are all far more profound metrics, I think, than just solely focusing on burning fat. The fat burn tends to come as a natural byproduct, but as it relates to tonight's conversation, one of the things that is shown with this type of training is that there is going to be an increase in the insulin sensitivity. So this is in part how we burn our blood sugar. How do we use that blood sugar? And HIIT workouts have been shown to have up to a 58% increase in our ability to improve our insulin management. That's huge. That's a pretty substantial number there. And when you're better managing your insulin, you're going to be more efficient at burning fat. This all comes down to something that's called EPOC, and that's just simply spelled EPOC. But what EPOC stands for is your excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. That is a mouthful to simply say nothing more than how much energy are you expending after you exercise. And what we know from HIIT is that when following a HIIT workout, you're going to have a higher and longer period of post-exercise calorie burn compared to a non-HIIT type of workout. So it's really advantageous over a 24-hour time frame. I should actually say it's more advantageous over a 24-hour time frame following a HIIT activity or a HIIT workout compared to a non-HIIT workout. Now, you may look at this and think, is this really for me? This seems like a young person's game here. And I hope the next couple of slides that I share with you completely refute that ideology. But I will say, going into this information, that HIIT is relative. So it's, intensity is relative. The intensity for a 20-year-old and the intensity for a 70-year-old are not going to be the same, but that 70-year-old can still do similar activities and get a challenge out of those relative to where they are at that point in life. So don't let the ideology around age or I can't do a certain exercise slow you down. Again, you can adapt HIIT to whatever you're doing. So in that mindset, you'll notice on this one, I'm going to start us out with chronic disease here. And again, we know chronic diseases. This particular study speaks to middle-aged and older individuals. But here we're looking specifically at type 2 diabetes. And notice on this is that the effect of HIIT was greater compared with this moderate intensity continuous training. So basically, shorter time investment yields a greater outcome. And graphically, let me show you what this looks like in regards to the glucose management here. And let me break this graph down for you. The three lines there, the top line is just the control. This was someone who didn't do any type of activity whatsoever. And you can see that over time, their blood sugar does start to drift down, but it stays higher for a longer period of time. And then the green line that you see, this is going to be the individual that does moderate intensity, but sustained activity. And then you'll notice the line, the lowest line there, the red one, that's your high intensity interval training. These individuals had a quicker recovery of their blood glucose following activity than individuals that were doing no activity, or even individuals that were doing some type of moderate intensity activity. So if we look at these as a direct comparison, we can see that this all boils down to adaptation. What is it that you're doing? What is the intensity that's going to create the adaptation? And the HIIT is what's going to do that. That provides the physiological stimulus that forces your body to adapt on a hormonal level. It causes it to adapt on a neurological level and on a musculoskeletal level as well. So there's all these different facets of adaptation here. And then you can also pull into that this whole conversation around what we think about as cardio fitness, is cardiorespiratory improvement is going to be heightened with HIIT versus with a moderate intensity activity. And again, I go back to the two classic examples on this. If you look at the marathon runner versus the sprinter, and I think Olympics on this because these are the world-class athletes where it's easier to differentiate this with. But if you look at the sprinter, that sprinter typically has a leaner appearance. They have a more typically have more muscle tone. They're going to be able to be very adept to explosive activities where they need to manage a threat very quickly, versus someone who's engaged in that more sustained aerobic, classic aerobic activity over an extended period of time. Those individuals tend to have more of a wasted appearance. They tend to look older, if you will, because they've engaged in that period, that exercise, those exercise periods repetitively for long periods of time. And what that ultimately does is it creates a lot of inflammation, better characterized as oxidative stress, but generically thought about as inflammation. It creates a lot of that in the body, and it takes a lot of toll on the body over time. So we don't want to get in a pattern where that's the case. Certainly not if we can get a better outcome with high intensity interval training. Now, can we build a healthier heart doing this? And this is an important conversation because this is obviously a serious chronic disease threat in the United States. It has been for an extended period of time. It continues to be. We're literally into decades of conversation around this. But we also appreciate that there are many things that we can do to offset the impact that this has on our offset the impact or the trajectory towards any type of cardiovascular disease. And right at the top of that list is going to be physical activity. If we can build a stronger heart, a more efficient heart that doesn't have to work as hard, then by all means, of course, we would do that. But to do that, I'm going to ask you a question to start us out down this road here. And let me just simply say here, when's the last time you worked so hard you couldn't breathe? Like you literally were pushing yourself to the point that it felt like your heart was just going to pounce out of your chest. It was beating so hard. Many of you might think, I haven't done that probably maybe even since I was a kid. And there's no reason for that. We all should do that from time to time as a part of these cycles that I'm talking about here, because we don't want to do this too frequently, but if we do it frequently enough within reason, we build a heart and a tissue that is far, far more resilient. And when it comes to HIIT, what many people would look at and say, well, that's extreme. It's extreme for a short period of time. And if you did it every day, day in and day out, it would in fact be detrimental. So we're only looking to do this rather infrequently, but we do want to push ourselves to the point that we're doing that. Now, some may look at that and say, well, gosh, Dr. Hill, is pushing yourself that hard really safe? Well, let's see what the evidence on this says. And in fact, if we ask this question, is it safe for the general population? That's one question, right? That's one segment that we could talk about and answer that. But what about, is it safe for individuals that actually have a chronic disease or that haven't been doing any type of exercise? And notice on this, preoperative high intensity interval training is effective and safe, and note the wording here, in deconditioned patients with lung cancer. And that is a severe state, folks. And this was actually not just, we what we would call an epidemiological study where we went back and we retrospectively looked at this, or we just followed a group over time. No, this was actually an intervention trial where they set up the parameters on this and had these folks follow through on this type of training specifically that we're talking about tonight. And it was shown to be effective and safe in these individuals to push them to this level. So if it is safe and effective in this category of individual, it's safe and effective for pretty much everyone out there. Now, there may be exceptions to that, but my guess is that if you're listening to this, you're probably not one of those. Now, what about with the age factor here? We'll look at what happens here. And let me bring into the conversation the mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to be the energy producing components of the cell. So when we think about kicking out our energy molecules that are going to allow us to follow through and do the things that we need to do every day, that's going to be the mitochondria that are responsible for that. And notice that in both older females and males, that HIIT induces favorable adaptations. And there's that key word, adaptation again. How do we elicit an adaptation in skeletal muscle in older subjects by increasing the mitochondrial content? So basically, the concern here is that as we age, our ability to hang on to our muscle becomes a little more challenging because we don't have the same hormonal stimulus. But here's what you're often not told on this is that if you create the right environmental stimulus, meaning the right exercise, and especially if you follow that up with the right dietary intake, you ultimately drive muscle tissue synthesis as you age. There's not this number or age at which that stops. You can continue to push that development of muscle tissue at any age. And so this in many ways comes back down to the activity of these mitochondria, and you stimulate these mitochondria with this high intensity interval training. And just to show you that this doesn't take months or years to happen, guys, this can happen in as short as 2 weeks. Notice on this, over only 2 weeks, HIIT, high intensity training, interval training, significantly increased mitochondrial function in skeletal muscle. That's significant. I mean, and you think about, look at today, look at the calendar for today and just mark 2 weeks from now and just tell yourself, you know what? I could be literally a different person in 2 weeks. I could have a skeletal structure that is more adapt and can accommodate to challenges much easier in 2 weeks from right now. That's significant. And that, I think, should be motivating. Now, do you need equipment to do everything that I'm talking about? Well, in short, the answer is no. And the nice thing about that is that if you don't need equipment, then there's not going to be any expense. But can you incorporate equipment? Yeah. And that's the beauty of this, is that you can go as no tech, low tech as you want to, up to as high tech as you want to go with this too. And if you want to do this and complete this with your own body weight, then by all means, you can start there. If you want to go up the next level and incorporate in some running or some sprint biking, even grabbing a jump rope and jumping. And if you don't want to jump rope, just pretend you're jumping the rope, right? You can do the same thing without the rope and get the intensity up. They even make these little handles with these balls on the end of them that you can hold one of those in each hand if you can't jump, but you can spin that ball in each hand and it'll mimic the weight of that rope swinging around. So there's all kinds of ways to do this, but it doesn't have to be cumbersome at all to get this incorporated in, because remember, the goal is to drive your heart rate, to increase your heart rate. And that's what's ultimately when you come into that post-exercise time frame, which is really where all the recovery and all the attributes come about. That's where all that's developed at, is in the post-exercise time frame. That's where the muscle building and the fat loss is going to take place at. So I'm just thinking of some other exercises here for you that you could incorporate. So things like, a high knee, where you're just standing in place, or you could even do this in running type of fashion, where you're just bringing your knees up to your chest, or what's called fast feet, where you're just moving your feet quickly back and forth or from side to side. You could follow that up with doing some jumping lunges, if you will. And then depending on what your capabilities are, you can scale this up. You could, incorporate in things like do some body weight squats and follow that with push-ups, and then follow that right after that with some burpees. There's all kinds of ways you can do this. And I'm going to give you some examples here in a moment, but just know that you don't need any equipment to get started on this. Some of my personal favorite pieces of equipment, if I'm looking to keep this fairly low tech, I really like bringing in the body weight exercises and having some of the bands along with those, the resistance bands. And those make great combinations, especially when you start looking at doing squatting activities with these bigger bands, where you can wrap those bands around your shoulder and then stand up with those, where the band is pulling down on you, but you're standing up. That'll get your heart rate up pretty quick. And here's the interesting thing about that. You don't have to do that very fast. You can do that very slow and very methodical, because intensity, and remember, this is high intensity. There's many ways to modulate intensity. You can do it with speed. You can do it with time. You can do it with resistance. So use it. Different angles of movement can all affect the intensity. So use any number of those to try to get at increasing the intensity in your workout and creating some variability and making it where it's fun for you over time. You're not doing the same monotonous thing over time. Now, speaking to this increase in metabolism here, I wanted to speak just momentarily about this with growth hormone. This is a hormone we hear about sometimes. When you're doing HIIT training, there's the potential, based on what's been shown in the research, to push your growth hormone up by 450%. Now, it'd be nice if it would sustain there, but it's not going to sustain there. It's going to be a temporary increase. But with that temporary increase also comes increase in muscle strength. You're going to develop the bones more efficiently. They're going to have greater resiliency, less chance of developing a fracture over time. The cardiovascular disease risk, that's going to be reduced. And then, not to mention that we all like to slow down the aging process as much as we can. And growth hormone is considered the anti-aging hormone, if you will. Now, remember, challenging. It has to be hard. It has to be difficult, but it does not need to be long. You need to challenge yourself. And if you're not hitting that point of challenging yourself, you almost have to ask the question, why am I doing this again? I need to be trying to achieve something here. Otherwise, you could probably be going and using your time better in some other way. So think about the challenging part of this, and it's the intensity, working hard through the whole workout. You work hard, you take a rest in there. You work hard, you take a rest in there. But it's that cycle that, if you look at the whole pattern of your exercise for that bigger bout of activity, your intensity stayed high for that entire period of time. And here's what you have to keep in mind. You're not looking to do this for an hour, 2 hours. This is short duration. So you can handle doing stuff like this for a short duration. And the beauty of this is that you go in, you knock it out, and you're done, and you're moving on, and you're not having to continue to invest time in this. So, again, we want to be efficient in the use of our time. So this is a great, great way to do that. Now, let me transition into, I've given you more of the, maybe best stated, the philosophy behind this, the science behind this, why it's important to incorporate this, not necessarily as a sole strategy for your exercise, but as a strategy, a component to your exercise. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears with you here, and we're going to start talking about some of the different methodologies that you can use to do this. There's 3 of these that I'm going to talk with you about. And the first one is what's known as the Tabata method. And I like the Tabata method. It's just a fun way to mix things up from time to time. It's one that I've used. One of my favorite Tabata workouts was, I would do a rowing activity on a row machine. I would row for 20 seconds hard, and then I would hop off of the row machine and I would do 20 push-ups, and then I would rest for 20 seconds, and then I would just repeat that. And so there's different ways you can do this, but the general scheme on these is going to be that you do your warm-up, and then you're going to have some high-intensity work for 20 seconds. Again, guys, 20 seconds. And then you're going to follow that with 10 seconds off. And you do cycles of that. And typically these cycles last for a total of 4 minutes. So you may do something like lunges, and you would do lunges for 20 seconds, and then you would take 10 seconds as a rest period. And then you would go back in and you do another 20 seconds of lunges and then a 10-second rest period. And you continue to go through these for about 4 minutes total on that particular exercise. And then you switch to the next exercise and you do that. And typically with these Tabata workouts, you may do 8 rounds, something like that. 8 to 10 rounds is typically what you do on one particular exercise to get to that 4 minutes. But your total workout time, we're talking 20 minutes total workout time. And at the end of 20 minutes, you're going to feel gassed. You're going to feel like, you know what? I just put out some effort and I feel energized. And so you'll reap the benefits of that over time. So that's the Tabata method. Now, the next one that I'm going to share with you is what's known as the Little method. And this is based off of a researcher, or based from a researcher named John Little. Interestingly, I'll backtrack for just a moment and tell you about the Tabata method. That's from a Japanese researcher named Azumi Tabata. And I was doing some research on this a few days back, and I came across an actual paper by Azumi Tabata. He was writing a lot of the literature on this that helped design this style of training. But this Little method, this is a little bit different. And the key difference on this Little method is that the time frames are extended. So there's going to be 60 seconds of high intensity work where you're at that 95 to 100% range. At 60 seconds, you're doing that. And then you're going to take a 75-second recovery. And then you'll go 60 seconds of exercise again, and then 75 seconds of recovery. And you alternate back and forth on this for, say, 8 to 12 cycles, and that's your workout. That's the entire workout. Now, there's a third method here, which is known as turbulence training. And turbulence training is a bit of a nuanced HIIT methodology. It tends to incorporate in some strength training in this. So if you're looking to do body weight exercise or the bands that I mentioned, or if you're looking to incorporate in, say, like the dumbbells that the lady's holding here, this is probably more of the style that you're looking to evolve into. And again, you can use these concepts in all of these different training styles that I'm talking about. But what's different about your turbulence is you're going to start out with your 5-minute warm up. You'll get into what we would think about as a classic set with, whether it's the dumbbells or the band, some type of classic resistance training. And then you're going to follow that up with a minute of some type of classic cardio activity. So for example, jumping rope or burpees, something like that. That's what's going to follow. So you do your set of resistance training to exhaustion, and then you follow that up with some type of more cardio oriented type of activity, and you rest. There's going to be about a minute rest there, and then you repeat that. And you do that for a couple of cycles, and your max workout time here should be 20, definitely not over 30 minutes on this, and your workout's done. Now, I have to make sure that I tell you on this, since we are talking about exercise, I think it's also important that if I'm going to tell you the hows, I also have to make sure that you don't step into the pitfalls either here. And dynamic stretching is going to be, or dynamic warm-up is going to be one of the things we have to talk about. And the reason being on this is that this is much different than what has classically been thought about for a warm-up with stretching. I would absolutely tell you, don't do any type of static stretching. You've all seen the classic example of someone bending over, touching their toes. Don't do that before any workout or any type of stretch associated with that. What you're asking for to happen there is some type of muscle injury, because you don't have the muscle warmed up. You don't have the blood flow into that muscle. It's much more advantageous to do a dynamic warm-up. And dynamic warm-ups truly are nothing more than a bit of a modified version of the activity that you're going to be going into. So for example, if I'm going to be doing some type of pressing movement over my head, where I'm pressing a dumbbell or a barbell or something over my head, or a band, whatever that is, then I'm going to just take my arms and that's my shoulder joint is predominantly one of the joints that I'm affecting there. So I'm just going to do some arm circles out in front of me or out to the side of me. I may do some rotator cuff exercises just to get my shoulder blades warmed up and press my shoulder blades down against my rib cage. just to make sure that those are functioning good, because the shoulder blades are involved in that exercise too, right? So the point being on this, and listen, a dynamic warm-up could literally be doing nothing more than just doing that movement without resistance. So again, take that overhead press. I'm doing that overhead pressing motion and getting some blood flowing into that area without any resistance whatsoever. So it can be as simple as that. But the point is, you're far better off doing a dynamic warm-up than you are a static stretching type of warm-up. Now, let me take you through a progression here of a 10-minute beginner, a 20-minute beginner workout, and then we'll get into the 30 minutes here. So a 10-minute workout, these are great. 10 minutes, you can hustle and get a lot done in 10 minutes. And the way you would do this is implement that dynamic warm-up, do 20 seconds of work, and again, do it in a way where you can be slow and methodical depending on the exercise. It may be more of a fast-paced exercise. For example, you see the gentleman on the screen here, looks like he's punching. If you were punching at something for 20 seconds, that would be a fast exercise. And you may look at that and go, well, I don't have anything in my home to punch. Yes, you do. You all have pillows on your bed. And so you can just punch a pillow, and it's something that you can do for 20 seconds, and you'll increase your heart rate in that 20 seconds of doing that. Follow that up with 10 seconds of rest and alternate back and forth on that for a couple of cycles. And then you can follow that up with doing something as simple as some jumping jacks, and then maybe a couple of body weight squats, and you've got a full workout. You've got your heart rate up. You come to that exercise in 2 or 3 days to do it again, and you notice, you know what? I was able to do this exercise a little easier this time than I was the first time I tried this. So that can all be done as quick and as simple as 10 minutes. Now we take a step up from there and we go to 20 minutes. And in a 20-minute pattern, again, you still want to do your warm up. It's critical to get that warm up in there. And this time you would want to do, say, 45 seconds of work. And again, if you're doing some resistance training, do as many reps as you can, slow, methodical, get that burn going on the muscle where it's really fatiguing. And then when you get to the point where you feel like, you know what, I can't quite push anymore, keep pushing, because that adaptation is really where where your resistance, where you can't push anymore, but you continue to, that's where the adaptation really begins to shine. That's where a lot of adaptation's taking place at. You do that 45 seconds of work, and then you follow that up with 15 seconds, and you cycle that again, and you do a couple of rounds of that, say 3 rounds of that. And then you can do, again, some things like push-ups or squats, and you use the same ideology. I do those squats for 45 seconds, slow, methodical, and then I might follow that up with just doing some, say, butt kicks. You guys have all seen the butt kicks where you're trying to hit your butt with your heel. You do that for, say, 45 seconds, and then you take a rest period in there. So it's this high intensity, and then you bring the intensity back down for a short period of time, and then you bring it back up again, and you bring it down again for a short period of time. Now, what about the next one? There's a step up from here where we could go 30 minutes. And why do I say, 30 minutes as if it's the pinnacle? Well, if you're doing these exercises right, you really shouldn't be able to go past this. I mean, 30 minutes is really, even for some individuals that are trained, going all out, that's a pretty extended period of time. But the idea is that think about the next thing that you want to strengthen in your workout. You've got that cycle, that strategy of you start out warming up, you do a 45-second activity, you do a 15-second rest, you follow that up in doing 3 rounds of that, and you can vary the number of rounds. That's completely arbitrary and whatever you enjoy or looking to try to achieve. And then you incorporate in the next exercise. So maybe that's doing the side lunges, or doing jumping jacks, or doing knee raises, something like that, a reverse lunge, if you will. Doing those for a period of time for 45 seconds until you feel challenged, until that heart rate is up. That's what we're looking for, and then rest. Now, what about the mistakes? I wanted to really go through and define these with you and help you try to avoid these. So one of the biggest mistakes right out of the gate is not effectively using a dynamic warm-up. It's amazing how much better you'll feel going into your working activity when you do that dynamic warm-up. And frankly, these exercises, they're physically demanding. I mean, this type of exercise is not, this is not passive. You're actively getting after it. And we want to make sure that the muscles are in a position to handle the activity that you're doing or that you're going to be doing. These workouts, these HIIT workouts, they're designed to be short. They're designed to be intense. So, I'm saying, and I've been basically pushing on this to say, you really want to push yourself here. But on the opposite side of this, you don't want to overdo it either. You want to do enough to get the stimulus that we're looking for, and then you want to discontinue. You want to give your body the recovery time. You want to follow up, consume the right foods after this, eat some of the right muscle building, get the right protein in there, the right muscle building foods, and then give your body that recovery time. And then, again, going back the other direction, don't skimp on the activity either. When you get to the end of your exercise, if you didn't feel challenged, if you're not out of breath, you probably didn't hit the threshold that we're looking and really talking about to maximize this recovery, or to maximize this type of activity. Now, recovery, also think about this in terms of how frequently you do the exercise. You want to do these exercises generally about 3 times a week. Sometimes this may be 1 or 2 times a week. It just solely depends on how efficient you are at recovering, and that's based on how much output you had in the exercise session. But I would say if you're looking to go over 3 times a week, you're doing too much. For sure, you're doing too much over 3 times a week. But again, sometimes you can get this done in twice a week. So again, that's just one of the things I love about this. This can be a real time saver. The other thing I would tell you on this is don't feel like these moves that you're doing have to be fast and ballistic moves, right? I gave you the sprint ideology, but these can be very slow, methodical. So again, this concept of time under tension, if you think about lowering a weight very slowly, or doing a push-up, if you will, if I'm pushing up very slowly and letting myself back down very slowly and repeating that, I'm not going to be able to do as many of those, but you are surely going to be as muscularly fatigued with doing that exercise that way. And that is also a safe pattern of exercise to be involved in. Your likelihood of injury is going to be much less when we talk about doing things in a slow, methodical fashion. So those are probably some of the biggest mistakes I would say to try to avoid. Now, let me speak back to the Tabata time here just a minute. Get a timer. This is one of the things I wanted to tell you about this, and one of the reasons I wanted to come back to this. Get a timer. You can go to the dollar store and get a timer in the cookware section and just have that for $1 or $2. And that's just set the timer, and that tells you 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, or maybe you're doing the 45 seconds, 15 seconds alternating strategy. Regardless, that $2, $1 timer is going to be an extremely big asset for you when it comes to incorporating in things like the Tabata strategy, the little method, the turbulence training. That'll be a real asset for you to fall back on. Now, here's something else I've neglected to mention on this, is that this can be done anywhere. So let's say you go on vacation and you want to get your workout in. Hey, you can get that workout in right there in the hotel room or wherever you're at and do it in a few minutes. And hey, you're off to enjoy the rest of your vacation there. This can be done, say, if you're on a work trip. It doesn't really matter where you're at. The nice thing is that you can get a few of these in. It just really comes down to how creative do you want to be with the environment around you. And you may just, if you're a beginner on this, an easy one, say like you're in a hotel room or something like that on a trip, if you do say 50 sit-ups and then follow that with 40 jump squats and then do 30 push-ups and then 20 split squats and 10 tricep dips and a 30-second burpee. By the time you get done doing that, even a trained individual is going to be a little fatigued on that. I shouldn't say a little fatigued. They'll probably be a lot fatigued on that. So again, it's all relative to what your personal capabilities are. So look at this as it is a very flexible workout style, but it is also a workout style that adapts to the environment around you. And it can be as simple, meaning technology-wise with equipment, as you want it to be, or it can be as complex as you want it to be as well. So it's truly, if you take the exercises that you enjoy doing them and you move them into a Tabata style of exercise, I think you'll find a lot of enjoyment out of your exercise. And I think you'll find that you're gaining a lot from your exercise as well. So with that being said, guys, I want to say thank you for joining me for tonight's webinar. I hope you were able to find this information very valuable. I really enjoy sharing this type of content. Exercise is something that I've been involved in pretty much all my life, and learning different ways to manipulate my exercise pattern. And one of the things that I am doing now, if you haven't had an opportunity to check out our YouTube, my Dr. Arland Hill YouTube channel, I would highly recommend doing that, because there is and has been more content coming out with exercise as a focal topic on this. And I'm not solely focusing on the physical aspects of exercise, but also the mental aspects of exercise. So make sure you take note of that and don't overlook that. A couple of other resources for you here where you can find some additional information. If you have interest in what I do on the clinical side, things that are health and wellness related, you can find that information at drarlandhill.com. And then if you are looking for the cleanest produced meats that you can possibly find, that's what you're going to find at Harvest Hills Ranch. We don't cut corners on anything, and same thought process as far as putting information out there about that, trying to help you guys understand what quality food is. There's so much misinformation out there. So make sure you take a look at Harvest Hills Ranch for that information. And you'll also notice that we do have subscriptions, which have been very popular, and folks like to know that the quality food that they want to consume is going to show up every month, and they don't have to put any thought into it. So we're supporting them on that now. So I want to say thank you again for your time, and I look forward to having you join me on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.